was on the wrong slide. So the first thing to say is that innovation really matters. Innovation is the reason we live completely different lives from our ancestors. It's the reason for incredible increases in prosperity over the last 200 years, but it's also the reason behind a lot of things like the problems with social media or how warfare changes or something like that. So it matters enormously. And it has been spectacular, the effect of innovation in the past couple of centuries in particular. Here's a chart that gives you an idea of what's happened. This is the price of lighting in pounds over the centuries. Now, how you can calculate the price of lighting in 1301, I don't know, but they had a go at it, some economists did, and this is what they came up with. And the collapse of the cost of lighting, the way it went from a luxury to a trivially cheap thing that's available to everybody is pretty spectacular. But even this chart underestimates to some extent what's gone on, because if you measure the cost of lighting in terms of time rather than money, how long it takes someone to purchase a certain quantity of lighting, if they work on the average wage, then you see an even more spectacular change. The labor cost of 1,200 lumen hours of light at the average US wage. Today, it's something like a third of a second of time of work will buy you enough light to turn on an ordinary lamp for an hour, roughly speaking. Back in 1950, 8 seconds of work on the average wage. That's a significant difference, actually. And back in 1880, with a kerosene lamp, you'd have had to pay 15 minutes of work to buy an hour of light. In 1800, 6 hours of work to buy 1 hour of light. That brings home just how the average person simply could not afford a candle in 1800. So that's the impact that innovation can have if it is allowed to. And let's just remind ourselves that the people who behind a lot of these innovations that change the world are surprisingly ordinary or non-expert people quite often. And to remind us of that, let's just think of a recent and very vital innovation, vaccination. Vaccination, or inoculation, or engrafting as it was first called, first reached Europe as a result of this woman. Her name was Lady Mary Wortley Montagu. She was the wife of the British ambassador in Constantinople in the early 1700s, and she discovered that the women in the harem of the Sultan were deliberately giving a little bit of smallpox to their kids in order to make them immune for life. And she came back and she persuaded the Prince of Wales to try this habit. She did it on her own kids. She was a smallpox survivor herself, and she'd lost her brother to it. She became incredibly unpopular with the medical establishment. Everybody says this was a dangerous thing to do, which it was. They said it was a foolish thing to do. And of course, they said, we've no idea why this would work. And they didn't know. And they didn't know how it would work or why it would work for nearly 300 years. Something very similar happened in Boston around the same time. A slave by the name of Onesimus, working for a preacher called Cotton Mather, said to Mather when there was an outbreak of smallpox in Boston, you know what, back home in Africa, we deliberately inoculate kids against smallpox. He tried to persuade several people about this. A medic named Zabdiel Boylston took up the idea, inoculated 300 people, and made himself incredibly unpopular. He had to hide from the mob for 2 weeks in a cupboard to escape being lynched for this ridiculous and dangerous thing. But as I say, it was nearly 300 years before we understood why vaccination works or inoculation works. And yet it was an innovation that changed the world 300 years ago and is, of course, changing the world even as we speak today. There's several things I want to say about innovation before we get on to the economics of it and how governments can or cannot influence it. The first really crucial thing, I think, is to realize that innovation is not the same as invention. Lady Mary Wortley Montagu did not invent vaccination, but she did innovate it. She brought it to a different country. She made it available. She made it affordable. She made it reliable. Well, other people did those things as well. And that's what most innovation is. It's about making things affordable, available, and reliable, rather than necessarily coming up with the first prototype. And just to illustrate the difference between innovation and invention, there's a lovely story that Charles Towns, the inventor of the laser, used to say about a beaver and a rabbit looking at the Hoover Dam. And the beaver is saying to the rabbit, "No, I didn't build it, but it is based on an idea of mine." Now, a lot of people can have a bright idea, but it takes a lot of work to turn those bright ideas into things that actually change the world. And we tend to forget about the people that do this. We tend to raise statues and give prizes to the people who do the original invention, but we forget about the people who make that invention reliable, affordable, and available. So a lot of my emphasis is on innovation rather than invention. Innovation is a serendipitous process. That is to say, there's always a lot of luck, and there's a lot of changing of direction. Many, many innovators talk about the fact that they set out in one direction and ended up going in another direction. Art Fry was the guy who invented the Post-it note at 3M, and he was looking for a kind of glue that worked with paper and was permanent, and he was disappointed to come up with a temporary glue for paper. And then he thought, I'm going to acquire practice tonight. This could be useful for holding my place in the hymn book. And the idea of the Post-it note was born. Stephanie Kwolek at DuPont was looking for one thing, and she came up with another and realized that it had the potential to make bulletproof vests. It's a common practice among great innovators to be prepared to change your mind and change direction depending on what you find out, because a lot of it will come, as it were, out of left field. Innovation is more gradual than we think. We talk about disruptive, sudden, spectacular changes in the world as a result of innovations, but behind them always lies a gradual trend, a steady improvement in some technology to the point where it can break through, for example, and a steady improvement after the point of breakthrough where it continues to improve. If you think about the 20th century and electronics, you think about the invention of the transistor to replace the vacuum tube as a huge step change in history, a spectacular replacement of one technology with another. But here's a chart showing the cost of computing with these different technologies going right back to the beginning of the 20th century, and you see it's gradual. There is no step change. There is no lurch when you go from the vacuum tube to the transistor. The last of the old technology is often as good as the first of the new technology. That's a pattern you see again and again. So although the trend is gradual, the effects can be quite sudden and spectacular. Innovation is evolutionary. That is to say, you can trace descent with modification. You can trace the family trees of familiar technologies and objects. Here's how the mobile phone evolved over many decades. First of all, it got smaller, then it got bigger again. Nobody saw that coming. It's an interesting trend in the technology of that device. But by innovation being evolutionary, I mean something a little more subtle than that. I mean that actually it involves natural selection. It works by exactly the same means as evolutionary phenomena. That is to say, there's variation and selection. There's a French philosopher named Alain who said in 1908, every boat is copied from another boat. Let's reason as follows in the manner of Darwin. It's clear that a very badly made boat will end up on the bottom after one or two voyages and thus never be copied. One could then say with complete rigor, it is the sea herself who designs the boats, choosing those with function and destroying the others. And so, when you get on an airplane, you hope that it has been designed by an intelligent designer. But actually, when you think about it, all that designer did was take a previous design and adapt it. And the predecessor took a previous design and adapted it too, all the way back to the Wright brothers. And they adapted it by keeping successful innovations and discarding unsuccessful ones. And so in that sense, all our technology is constantly evolving through a form of natural selection. Now, natural selection works by combining and recombining genes in different combinations most of the time. Most novelty in biology is actually recombination rather than de novo invention of new devices. And the same is true of a lot of our technologies. They come about after conversations in which ideas meet and mate and have baby ideas. Here's my favorite example of what I call ideas having sex. It's called the pill camera. It came about after a conversation over a garden fence between a gastroenterologist and a guided missile designer. They came up with this idea that you swallow a pill and it takes a picture on the way through, and that gives you a record of what's going on inside you. It's not a particularly successful technology, but it's a nice example of two ideas coming together from very different directions. On my desk at home sits this object. It's an Australian hand axe of the kind used by Homo erectus. My wife bought it for me at eBay. And it's exactly the same size, I noticed one day, as one of the objects that was sitting next to it, which is a computer mouse. And this sent a shiver down my spine, because here I'm looking at 500,000 years of technological evolution, and yet they're both designed to fit the human hand. They're exactly the same size and shape. This isn't a fake photograph. All I've done is remove the logo from the mouse. I no longer use that mouse, but when I did, it wasn't something I made myself, whereas the axe was indeed made by the person who used it, made of a single substance. And the mouse is made of lots of different substances, plastic and metal and silicon, and made from lots of different ideas. The idea of plastic, the idea of computing, the idea of software. All these things occurred to different people at different times and different places, people who are long dead, people who are still alive, and yet they came together in one object. And for me, that is the big lesson of innovation, is that what we do is we bring together things and combine them in new and interesting ways. And therefore, I think the root of why we innovate as a species is because of the human habit of exchange. And that if you look at innovation over history, it happens where people are free to exchange, because they not only exchange goods, they exchange ideas. And this habit of exchange is deeply rooted in the human psyche. Even hunter-gatherers who haven't been in contact with human beings for other human beings for 10,000 years, like the Tasmanians, turned out to know exactly what trade meant when they were first contacted. It was not a foreign concept to them. And Tasmanians actually lost technology during 10,000 years. They actually became simpler in their technologies they used. They lost the ability to make bone tools. They lost the ability to make fishing equipment. The reason was because they were a very small population on an island. They weren't able to sustain the networks of exchange that you need to keep ideas alive, to keep specialization and exchange going. And this is a peculiar human habit. Other animals don't do this. You can try and teach chimpanzees to swap one kind of food for another, or monkeys. They just don't get it. It really doesn't come naturally to them. As Adam Smith said in 1776, no man ever saw a dog make fair and deliberate exchange of a bone with another dog. It's just something we do. And it lies behind the reason we are an innovative species in a way that most others are not. Now, innovation is also team sport. It's a mistake to think you can do it on your own. It's vital to understand that it's collaborative, that it's cooperative. This is a photograph of an event in December 1903 when a brilliant man, a man named Samuel Langley, set out to demonstrate that he had, in secret, on his own, invented the first flying airplane. As you can probably see from the angle of the airplane, it's not heading in the right direction. It went straight into the water after 20 feet. He'd had a huge grant from the US government to build this thing. He was the head of the Smithsonian Institution. He was far cleverer than anybody else in Washington. There was no point in him consulting other people, but it didn't work. 10 days later, on an island off North Carolina, two bicycle mechanics without a degree between them succeeded where Langley had failed. And what they had done differently, the Wright brothers, is that they had networked. They had picked the brains of anybody and everybody who was thinking about flight, people who were building gliders and kites, people who were experimenting in wind tunnels, people who were calculating with mathematics the ideal shape of an aerofoil. They were supremely interested in drawing upon the ideas of others. They particularly were relying on a guy called Octave Chanute in Chicago, who was at the core of a sort of web of interactions talking about flight at the time. So that's just a simple example of how innovation comes from collaboration, not from lonely intelligence. 100 stupid people who are talking to each other will achieve more than 100 clever people who don't talk to each other. Now, one of the weird things that comes out of this, I think, is that there is a strange difference between what we can understand as individuals and what we can achieve collectively. You may know this essay, I Pencil, written by Leonard Read in 1958, a short essay, a beautiful little essay in which a pencil sets out to discover how it came into existence. And after researching the world, the pencil comes to the conclusion that he is the product of the work of millions of people, because there was somebody cutting down a tree in Oregon whose wood was going to be used to make the wooden part of the pencil, and there was another person mining graphite in Sri Lanka whose graphite was going to be used in the pencil, and the lumberjack was drinking coffee, and the coffee had been brewed by somebody else and had been grown by somebody else, and the pencil was going to be transported by somebody else and assembled in the factory and then painted by somebody else, and somebody else was running the firm that was doing all this. There were millions of people involved in making one pencil, but not one of them knew how to make a pencil. Nobody knows how to make a pencil to this day. There is no human being who can do this from scratch, because the person who knows how to run a pencil factory doesn't know how to cut down a tree, and so on. That, to me, is a really important insight, and it's one that we do well to remember, that the intelligence that makes the world function for modern society exists among human brains, not within human brains. It is a network phenomenon. It is a cloud phenomenon. Innovation always relies on trial and error. This is, and if you talk to innovators, they say this again and again, that you have to keep trying things, you have to keep failing, and then eventually, if you fail often enough, you might succeed. As Thomas Edison said rather beautifully, I've not failed, I've just found 10,000 ways that won't work. He tried 6,000 different types of plant material before he settled on Japanese bamboo for the filament of his first light bulb. And that's what distinguished him from the other people inventing light bulbs at the time, was that he was prepared to put in even more effort, even more perspiration, as he put it, to make the inspiration come to life. So trial and error is an incredibly important part of this. Jeff Bezos says something very similar about Amazon. If you're not swinging and missing, then you won't swing and hit. You've got to keep failing in order to succeed. Well, I mentioned the light bulb, and the weird thing about the light bulb is that 21 different people invented it independently. And this is true of pretty well every technology you look at, that there is a queue of people saying, hang on, I invented that. How come this guy's getting the Nobel Prize or the patent or whatever it might be? Kevin Kelly explores this in his wonderful book, What Technology Wants. In the case of the light bulb, there was Edison in America, there was Swan here in the north of England, there was Lodygin in Russia, there was Maxim also in America, and so on. And they all came up with the idea of an evacuated glass bulb with a glowing filament in it run by electricity, all around the same time. Now, there's not something superstitious going on here. It doesn't imply that a deity has reached down from the sky and implanted the idea of the light bulb in human heads. What it implies is that there is a ripeness about ideas, that there comes a point where it's inevitable people will see it, and you don't need Edison or Swan or Lodygin. Somebody else will do it if they don't get around to it. You can see this much more clearly with a more recent example. The search engine is, I think, the most useful invention of my lifetime. I use it every day. It's hard to remember what life was like before it. You probably are young enough, most of you, that you don't remember what life was like before it. How did we ever look things up? How did we ever find information? It's hard to believe, but we managed it. And yet, when the search engine came along in the 1990s, it didn't need Sergey Brin to meet Larry Page and found Google. Anybody could have done it. In fact, anybody did do it. Lots of other companies started search engines around the same time. And if Google had never been founded, we'd still have search engines. Of course we would. In retrospect, it's blindingly obvious that as soon as the internet became a thing, that search would be a big part of it, and search would probably be the most lucrative way of making money out of it as well, as Google discovered. And yet, if you go and look at what people are saying about the internet in the 1980s, just before it goes viral, as it were, nobody is predicting the importance of search. Even Larry Page and Sergey Brin didn't realize they were inventing a search engine. They thought they were cataloging the internet to start with. So there's a weird asymmetry in innovation. It's fantastically obvious that it had to happen when it happened in retrospect. It's not at all obvious in prospect when you're looking forward. That's something that still partly puzzles me. It has the effect that people say some very, very stupid things about the future because they don't see round the corner and see what's coming. Here's Ernest Rutherford, the winner of the Nobel Prize for splitting the atom, saying in 1933, really quite late, anyone who expects a source of power from the transformation of the atom is talking moonshine. Here's Ken Olsen, the chairman of the most successful computer company of the 1970s, the one that made the smallest computers, the mini computers, saying, there's no reason anyone would want a computer in their home. And here's Paul Krugman, the Nobel Prize-winning economist in 1998, during the dot-com boom, saying, by 2005, it'll become clear that the internet's impact on the economy will have been no greater than the fax machines. Actually, I can't read this. It's behind something on my screen, so it doesn't matter. If you can read it, good, well done. Steve Ballmer saying the iPhone's not going to get any market share, which was a spectacular misjudgment. Now, I'm not just putting this up to embarrass these guys, although it is quite fun. I'm mainly putting it up to remind us that we are really bad at reading the future of technology. All of us, myself included. I mean, when I was born in 1958, this is what the future was going to look like in the year 2000, according to a comic strip. It's a mailman delivering ordinary letters by jetpack. Okay, so he's jumping from garden to garden with his jetpack in order to deliver letters. So no mention of email, but a ridiculous technology on his back that never was invented. Okay, now what's that? That's interesting because in the 1950s, the future was going to be all about technology. It was going to be all about transport because the previous 50 years had been all about transport. Oh, sorry, just to mention, not everybody gets the future wrong. Here's a German 1920s, I think it is, image of what the future is going to look like. It's pretty well spot on, isn't it? It's exactly what we're doing today, apart from the outfits. So it's not all, not everything gets wrong. But in the 1950s, the future was going to be all about transport because the last 50 years have been all about transport. If you think about it, between 1900 and 1950, there had been incredible changes in transport. There were first cars, the first airplanes, the first helicopters, the first rockets, but no change in communication and computing pretty well at all. The telephone was there at the beginning of this period, the telephone is there at the end of this period. In the second half of the 20th century, it was the exact opposite. Almost no new technologies in the second half in transport, maybe the drone, but an extraordinary explosion of new devices and technologies in communication and computing. And so we were wrong to think that transport was going to go on changing, and we were wrong to think that communication and computing would not change. Well, that implies that today we're wrong to think the future is all going to be about computers. And I suspect we are wrong to think that. I think Moore's law is running out of steam. I think the need to replace your iPhone has dramatically changed. I think there are technologies in computing and communication like Google Glass that have flopped. I think that we're going to hit diminishing returns in computing and communication, and that the next 50 years is going to be about biotechnology, for example, which is just coming of age. But as I've just said, everybody is really bad at predicting the future, including me, so you shouldn't believe a word of what I just said. And another reason we can't read the future is because of what I call the Amara hype cycle. Roy Amara, 1960s computer scientist in California, said, we underestimate the impact of a new technology in the long run, but we overestimate it in the short run. We expect too much of things just after they get invented, but then we're taken by surprise by what happens a few years after that. So that's why Paul Krugman got the internet wrong, if you like. In other words, the adoption of a technology is not linear. It doesn't come in at the same rate. it's very, very slow to start with and very, very fast after a while. And just to illustrate that with some obvious recent technologies, I think the internet is not disappointing at the moment. I think over the last 15 years, it has spectacularly over-exceeded our expectations. I think genomics has been disappointing for 20 years since the first genome was sequenced in 2000, and Bill Clinton said this was the end of cancer. But I don't think it's going to be so disappointing in the future as the messenger RNA vaccines that we're all getting has shown us. I think AI has still got quite a bit of disappointing to do, and I suspect driverless cars and things like that are further away than we think. And as for blockchain, it's hardly begun to disappoint us yet. It's got a long way to go before it takes over the world, but it might do one day. Everybody thinks in terms of science leading to understanding, leading to application, leading to technology. It's called the linear model. And yet, people who study this stuff have been saying the linear model's not right for 50 years or more. They've been saying that technology is the seed of science as well as the fruit. It's often where science starts. You invent a technology and then you try and understand it. You invent vaccination long before you understand the immune system. You invent steam engines long before you understand thermodynamics, and so on. And a very nice example of this is the brilliant new genetic technology, CRISPR, gene editing technology, which came out of a university, came out of Berkeley and MIT, and has been adapted to enable us to precisely edit genomes. But where did those guys get the idea in the university? They got it from a yogurt company in France, where Philippe Horvath, this guy, and others were developing an understanding of the immune systems of bacteria and how they were able to recognize genetic sequences of viruses in order to defend themselves. And he got it from a Spanish academic who was studying salt-loving bacteria and archaea in Algeciras, because that's where there was a big salt industry. So the connection, ideas start in industry and then go to academia and vice versa. It's not a one-way street. Innovation is expected to destroy jobs in every generation, going back to the threshing machines of the early 1800s, or forward to the computer panics of the 1960s when all jobs were going to disappear and we were all going to have to learn to live with leisure, and yet it never happens. Today we're worried about AI taking jobs. I suspect this is just a new middle-class version of other panics about job losses caused by technology. Now it's the lawyers and doctors who are worried about losing their jobs, whereas before it was assembly line workers. But of course, technology creates new kinds of jobs. Explain to a Victorian what a software engineer or a flight attendant is. They wouldn't know what you were talking about. There is one respect in which innovation does destroy the need for quite so much work and give us more leisure. And it's illustrated, I think, by a calculation I did a few years ago about how long you will spend in work as a percentage of your entire life on this planet. Back in 1900, when people died in work before the age of 60 and joined the workforce in their early teens and worked 60-hour weeks, then they would spend around 25% of their life actually at work. The rest was sleeping or eating or as a child or something like that, which is a surprisingly small number when you think about it. Today, if you live to 80 and you're in education to 25 and then you're in retirement from 65, so you spend half your life either in education or retirement, and you work a 39-hour week, then basically you're going to spend less than 10% of your life at work. That's extraordinary when you think about it, because what it means is that you can spend less than 10% of your life producing stuff for other people in order to be able to spend the other 90% consuming stuff that other people make for you. That's a great bargain when you think about it. The other thing innovation does is it enables us to do more with less. We can grow more food on less land, as this chart exemplifies. This is the total food grown in the world as and the amount of land you need to grow it on, 68% less land to grow a given amount of food because of improvements in technology and chemicals and fertilizer and genetics and all those kind of things. We use about 13% as much aluminium to make a drinks can as we did when drinks cans were first invented, for example. And that means that innovation is potentially infinite, because we're not going to run out of resources and say we can't invent anything more because we've got no metal left, we've got no iron left, we've got no copper left, or something like that. Because you can always say, oh, why don't we use less stuff to make the same thing? That's an innovation. It's economic growth, but it's physical shrinkage. And in fact, some of the big economies in the world, particularly the US, are now shrinking in terms of the amount of stuff they need. Not the amount of stuff per capita, the amount of stuff overall. If you add up all the imports of raw materials and all the mining and production of raw materials that America does, it's actually been going down now for about 10 years. And that's because we're more efficient in our use of these resources. So innovation, I think, is potentially infinite. Now, how do you get innovation and where does it come from? Empires ought to be really good at innovation because they're huge free trade areas. They've got a lot of wealth, they've got a lot of connections. They ought to be great, but they're not. The Roman Empire wasn't a very innovative period. The Ottoman Empire was a disaster as far as innovation concerned. The Ming Empire in China was actually a period of going backwards in terms of innovation. And why is this? Well, it's because they're run from the center. It's because centralized directives telling people what they can and can't do become a habit in empires. And the freedom to experiment, to try new things, to disrupt existing industries doesn't exist. The ability to lobby the center on behalf of an incumbent industry against an insurgent industry is too great. There's too many opportunities. You may or may not detect an analogy that I'm making here to the European Union. Something similar happens in big companies. We know that big companies are very bad at innovation. They know it. They struggle to try and do something about it. If you're Procter & Gamble, you set out to outsource your innovation because of this problem. If you're Lockheed, you set out to set up a skunk works to try and let some people do sort of weird stuff in one building away from the others. But big companies have often been just destroyed by innovation in rival firms. Two classic examples: Kodak didn't see digital photography coming, or rather it did see it coming and did nothing about it. It actually invented a primitive digital camera and said, well, we don't like this because it's a threat to the film industry. And we're in the film industry, so we're going to ignore this technology. Nokia became a very innovative, very successful company, by far the biggest mobile phone company in the world, through inventing mobile phones, brilliant, innovative company, and then became so big that it forgot to innovate, and it got stuck in voice technology, and it wouldn't let data come in, and so it was destroyed and was blown away, and is now a shadow of its former self and been taken over by rivals. We think innovation's popular. We all say we want more of it, but frankly, it's often not. Think of the failure of the European continent to adopt any genetic technologies in agriculture in the last 25 years, all because of movements like this to oppose it. The ability to whip up opposition to innovation is very, very strong these days. And we've seen it with other technologies too. And it's always been a problem for innovation. I'm going to illustrate this with a story about coffee. Coffee came out of Ethiopia, it came to Arabia in about 1500, it then spread to Europe, and wherever it turned up, people loved coffee. They thought, this is great, they love this drink. But it was banned everywhere. It was banned in Saudi Arabia, it was banned in Cairo, it was banned in Constantinople, it was banned in France, it was banned in England. The bans never worked. People found ways around them or just disobeyed them. Coffee was too popular, but boy, did they keep trying to ban it. And they had two reasons for banning it. The first was because the wine and beer industry didn't like a competitor, so it funded research by medics to say coffee was dangerous, that it dried up your kidneys, destroyed your liver, and all these kind of things coming from medical professors, this kind of stuff, bought and paid for propaganda against coffee. And the second reason that people didn't like coffee, the governments didn't like coffee, was because people drank coffee in coffee houses. And when they were in coffee houses, they had conversations, animated conversations because of the caffeine. And these animated conversations sometimes turned on the topic of whether or not the king was doing a good job. And sometimes they even ventured the opinion that he wasn't doing a good job. And this was completely unacceptable to rulers. So that, and here's Charles II being incredibly explicit about this in 1672 when he's banning coffee houses in London. He's saying that they must be banned because people come and broach lies and arraign the reputations of their governors and insinuate a prejudice against the rulers and so on. Basically, he doesn't like fake news being spread in cafes. In that case, coffee won through in the end. Boy, did people try and stop it. Now, here's the key point. How do you get innovation going in the world? What are the policies that encourage it? Well, we can come up with lots of vague stuff about the importance of money, the importance of freedom, the importance of opportunity, the importance of exchange and contact with people, and I have done. But that's not quite good enough, isn't it? Because, how do we explain Israel being great at innovation, Singapore less so, as Robert said? How do we explain China being good at innovation, which it has been in the last 20 years? It's not a free country, far from it. Surely that implies that it shouldn't be good at innovation. And the lesson most people are taking from China at the moment is that governments need to get in there and direct innovation themselves. Governments need to be in charge of the innovation machine and to make it happen and to decide where it goes next, because that's what the Chinese Communist Party does. I think that's a bad misreading of China. I think what happened is that Deng Xiaoping created enormous economic liberty in China while sustaining zero political liberty. So if you were an entrepreneur or an innovator in China, after Deng Xiaoping's reforms, you had almost no obstacles in the way of you. If you wanted to start a business or invent a gadget or build a new factory or something, you didn't need permission from bureaucrats and officials to anything like the same extent you did in the West, so long as you weren't inventing a new political party to challenge the Communist Party. I think that's changing under Xi Jinping. The way that he's treated Alibaba and Jack Ma is a good indication that the economic freedom is coming to an end, and that China is reverting to the Ming Empire, which it was like in the 1600s, when essentially in the Ming Empire, a merchant had to get permission from a mandarin before he even left his hometown, let alone traded abroad, which was basically not allowed at all. And the Ming Empire came after the Song Empire, which was the period of incredible innovation in China, when the compass and gunpowder and the printing press and all sorts of things like that were invented. And what was different about the Song Empire from the Ming Empire was that the Song were almost totally decentralized. They left economic decisions to local merchants all over the country. It wasn't an empire so much as a confederation of city-states. So that seems to me to be one really important lesson for how you get innovation going. You unleash the liberty of people to come up with ideas themselves, because we're really bad at predicting which technologies are going to take off next. We're really bad at working out which ones to adopt. We're terrible at picking winners. Losers are very good at picking governments and demanding subsidies from them. And so in some sense, I think that we need to find a way to recreate the ferment of unpredictability that comes with freedom in order to be good at innovating. And the countries that can do that will do that best. And I think that best describes Silicon Valley. And America is making a historic mistake, in my view, at the moment, in reading the wrong lesson from China and saying the government needs to get much more involved in directing innovation and telling it where to go next. Thanks for listening to me. I've really enjoyed talking to you. I hope you've had a drink or two while I've been talking. I look forward to taking some questions.
Hi, Matt. Thanks for having us. First of all, I wanted to say thanks. I read The Rational Optimist when I was a soldier back in 2015 on the Gaza Strip, and it was very depressing all around, but your book was very optimistic, so thanks for that. My question is, I would like to hear a little bit about what incentivizes the innovator. Is it fame? Is it greed? Is it prestige? What makes the innovator want to innovate?
Yeah, it's a really great question. And if you look at the story of great innovators, Thomas Edison, Marconi, the Wright brothers, you tend to get the same vision, which is just an obsession with doing what they're doing, a love of doing what they're doing that is way beyond simple explanations like money. Yes, they are definitely ambitious to get rich. And someone like Marconi is an interesting example of someone who was both an inventor and an innovator in that he also developed businesses that built on his inventions. But I think I'm quite generous in my interpretation of the motivations of innovators. I think most of them actually want to change the world, want to see their babies come to fruition. I mean, imagine the thrill of walking down the street and seeing everybody using a device that you invented. I think that would give you far more reward, psychological reward, than you would ever get financial or other. So, but let's not forget, the incentives have to be there. You have to be able to make a profit out of it. You have to be able to reward innovators. This touches on my skepticism about patents. I think patents and copyright, intellectual property generally, is hugely overrated as an important stimulator of innovation. In fact, I think it's often counterproductive. If you look at what happens when a patent expires, you get a burst of innovation. If you look at the way people use patents, it's often to defend their temporary monopoly and milk money from it. So I think patents distort the process of innovation too much, and we need to find a way of reforming them and getting back to the origin. And if I think about that as myself, I'm not an innovator, but I do write books, and hopefully they are a little bit innovative. And my books are protected by copyright. So that enables me to make money out of them. So here am I being a little bit hypocritical. But do I really need 70 years of copyright after my death, which is the UK law now, brought in a few years ago, so that my grandchildren can continue to make money from my books? I mean, let them get a blooming job instead. It's outrageous. Why have we got that law in this country? Because the Walt Disney Corporation lobbied governments all around the world to say, hang on, the copyright on Mickey Mouse is running out and we don't want to lose our best income stream. That's not a good reason. So when thinking about incentives, let's not overdo the importance of greed.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for the presentation. It was very, very interesting. By the way, one of my favorite economists, Professor McCluskey, just recommended your book, so it's going to be my next book.
She's my favorite economist too. Right.
So I was reading a bit about you, and I understand you were pro-Brexit, and you were insinuating before about the problem of big corporations, big empires. But the European Union also provided a single market, and now you've got all of the mess with the customs in Northern Ireland, and it's much more difficult for people to network because movement is more restrictive. You can get less employees. So I was curious, is your objection economic? And if so, why is that? And if it's not, what's the reason for that objection? Thank you.
Well, it's a great day to ask that question because we've signed a trade deal with Australia today, and it's the first trade deal we've negotiated from scratch since we left the European Union, and it's basically going to increase freedom of movement between the UK and Australia, and greatly cut tariffs on things like Scotch whisky and other exports that we can send to Australia, and on Australian wine to the UK and so on. So it illustrates the point that we eventually found, as a country that traded outside the European much more than most European Union countries did, as such a country, we found that that living behind a highly protectionist tariff wall was not a good idea, merely for the benefit of having free trade within the European Union. The European Union's approach to regulation is one of harmonization. It says the rules must be identical everywhere. And that actually flies in the face of history and of how trade works. Because I'm all for rules about safety or whatever it might be, but I believe in mutual recognition. I think if Britain says this device is safe, then the French should accept it. If the French say this device is safe, then the British should accept it. But it doesn't matter if they've arrived at that conclusion by different means. That's mutual recognition. And that's the way trade used to go. And I think harmonization destroys initiative, makes it very hard. And I think that's the reason the European Union has really struggled with innovation over the last 40, 50 years, and has fallen way behind others and has not produced a single digital giant to rival Amazon, Apple, Alibaba, and so on. For me, Brexit is still the right thing to have done. The fact that the European Union is behaving in a very sort of unfriendly way towards us and trying to over-interpret the Northern Ireland Protocol so that this tiny, tiny amount of trade that happens between Northern Ireland and Southern Ireland as a percentage of the whole European trade, that they're trying to pretend that that's a threat to some kind of European integrity, is just very much reinforcing our view that they are not reasonable people to deal with at the moment, and that we're right to have left. That's what most British people are concluding from the rows that are going on at the moment. But we want to be good neighbours rather than bad tenants of Europe. And we were bad tenants. We kept disagreeing with everybody. We kept getting overruled. We asked for reform. We said, look, if they'd given even a smidgen of reform to David Cameron in 2015, 16, we wouldn't have left. But they couldn't be bothered to even try.
First of all, thanks so much for this kind of talk. I would note that in my past life, I was a technology and intellectual property transactions attorney, and I totally agree with your point on patents. Today, patents are not used, to innovate at all. Big companies use it to just hinder innovation, but other companies, you have patent trolls. No kind of young entrepreneur is thinking of patents when they're innovating. They're thinking about being kind of first to market, their competitive advantage. Nobody really cares about whether you get patent protection. Most companies actually decide not to pursue that. So I totally agree with your point. So that's one thing. And my question is, what traits do you think a society needs at large to innovate? You mentioned, maybe not a lot of central planning, not a lot of government coercion. But are there any other traits for societies that kind of make them more open to innovation and more kind of susceptible to that? Yeah,
it's a really good question, and there isn't a simple answer to it, and there isn't. It's important to realize that there is no golden recipe available yet, and that's one of the things that fascinates me about innovation. It's this incredibly important thing that has transformed the world, and yet we don't really know how to turn it off and turn it on. But I would just at this point mention a really good example of a government passing legislation designed to allow an innovation to happen and being extremely successful at it. It's what happened in 1997 when the Clinton administration passed a series of bills through Congress which were designed to allow e-commerce to happen. And they included stuff like the fact that website operators were platforms, not publishers, so they couldn't be sued for content and things like that. But that's only a small part of it. It was the most extraordinarily libertarian document and series of documents. It was basically saying, if you want to start a business online in this new world, off you go, and it's permissionless. You can do what you like. Now, we're living with some of the negative consequences of that, of course, at the moment, in terms of the polarization of political discourse, the impacts of social media in all sorts of negative ways. But we're also living with the incredible positive impact of it, one of which is the fact that we're having this conversation 2,000 miles apart, and it's as if we were in the same room. And so in order to understand what a country should do, I would study the heck out of that example. I would read Adam Tira's books on that story, etc., and I would try and sort of try and work out what the lessons of that story is. As I say, the main theme of it is liberalizing, is freedom. But that's just a word. I'd like to know more about what was involved in that.
Thanks so much.
Hi. Hello, Matt. Thank you very much for the talk. I wanted to ask about something a little different, if it's possible, about the origins of virtue, which I actually think kind of connects to here. I mean, you said incentive is a big part of it, but I think it's fairly obvious that the ethics of a culture and the cultural norms also influence, the legitimacy of going the path of innovation, and also the way people really address innovators and give them the opportunities. And you talk about how cultures develop in certain ways, and when it's beneficial and when it's not. And the end result is we have certain cultures which really have cultural norms and virtues which are fitting for innovations, and some which don't at all. And I'm wondering, is there anything where you could, like somebody who studies this a little bit, what would you advise to a country where you feel the culture itself, not just the government institutions, but the actual culture and ethics are not fitting for innovation? Is there anything you think can be done at the cultural level to help those countries?
Yeah, it's a really important question, and it clearly matters enormously. The culture of trusting other people, the culture of not ripping each other off, is clearly a hugely important part of why some countries succeed and others don't. And there are whole theses written on what the Spanish sort of semi-feudal culture did to parts of America versus what the more sort of Anglo-Saxon culture did in other parts of the country. So there are historical aspects to this as well. You probably know Steven Pinker's book, The Better Angels of Our Nature, which talks about the decline of violence over the centuries, the extraordinary decline of violence. And the explanation for that seems to be cultural change. And the reason for the cultural change seems to be that what is admirable changes, what is honorable changes. So it is admirable and honorable to kill somebody who wrongs you in the sort of 1200s. By the sort of 1800s, it's not. It's despicable and punishable to do that. Because people will then respond, will say, oh, okay, in my society, it's not a good strategy for me to kill someone when he annoys me. in the later period. So it can be extremely infectious if you can get one of these cultural changes to happen. And the way in which culture changes is truly fascinating. I mean, just to think, in my lifetime, we have gone from not tolerance of paedophilia, but it's a bit of a blind eye to dodgy schoolmasters and things like that, to utter intolerance of that. And at the same time, we've gone from pretty utter intolerance of homosexuality to complete acceptance of that. Now, both of those, I think, are right. I'm very pleased that those trends have gone in those directions. But I'm just curious about how did that come about? How did we come down on the right side of both those questions at the same time, as it were, if that's what we've done? I mean, you can argue that we might look back in 50 years and say we were wrong in some way in the trends, or we hadn't gone far enough, or whatever it might be. So it's a very mysterious thing, culture, and how it evolves. But in terms of its impact on innovation, the really big one, and this is what I discuss at length in Origins of Virtue, is the evolution of trust, the ability to put in place institutions and conditions that enable people to earn the trust of others, and trust money and trust credit and all those kind of things become incredibly important. So that seems to me that the feature that we need to understand.
Thank you.
Yeah. Hello. Hi, nice to meet you. What in your opinion about, let's say, even not fake liberalism, just how liberalism influence innovation?
If liberalism influences innovation, but by liberalism, do you mean freedom, or do you mean left-wing politics, or because it's a word that often means different things to different people?
Yeah, so basically, of course, not freedom, because I believe freedom will get much more innovation.
Right.
But I think everybody, doesn't matter if you're left or right, can agree that some, like, let's say, extreme sides can influence the innovation. So just getting your opinion about it.
Yeah. Well, here's politically, I think one of the things that really worries me at the moment about the world, and I'm an optimist, I'm a rational optimist, but I think some of the discourse about how certain things are not allowed to be discussed and that kind of thing are going to make it very difficult to be innovative. I think one does need to have disagreement in society and debate in order to be able to innovate. And so I'm hugely in favor of free speech. And I worry that some of the cultural trends at the moment are against free speech.
Hello, thank you very much for your talk. I think my question is more specific about trends that happens today in these worlds. So for instance, if you look at China, which today monitor every single person who comes in the country or comes out of the country with some amazing innovation, as is they track every single movement of every single person using computer vision. And something interesting is happening, the same thing in London and in England, where now police is trying to match faces with different people, and they're not giving us the option, or not for me, we don't have it in Israel, but in different places, if I want or don't want to participate with this. Therefore, innovation is a great thing, but I think responsibility into innovation needs to come in some kind of place about who owns it. So if I'm thinking about ethics in innovation, as who's responsible to make sure of my own safety? Is it the government? And what happens if the government is the one who is pursuing this kind of innovation that is not necessarily moving forward for the greater good, but for the, let's call it the empire, as you said beforehand. And the same thing happened is for the certain person who comes with this technology and innovation. So we have the two heads of that. And what is your opinion of the ethics behind this and how governments should treat this? You're saying that you think governments need to push forward into innovation, which I very much agree. But where comes the responsibility of the single person and the government? Thank you.
Yeah, it's a huge dilemma, and you know, if I think back to my own view nearly 20 years ago, that the internet was going to be very, very liberating for people because we could communicate with each other, and we didn't have to go through the government. We didn't have to have monopolistic television channels or newspapers. It was going to be everybody understanding everybody else's point of view and enjoying a reasonable conversation, and it was going to be very difficult for governments to control what people thought in this world because of the ease of communication. Well, it hasn't quite worked out like that. It turns out that it is quite easy for governments to use these technologies for very much illiberal means. And if I think about, you know, the policy of lockdown is a sort of metaphor for this. If this pandemic had happened 10 years ago, when online working was much more difficult, I don't think we would have locked down societies because it would have been impossible to keep enough of the economy going. As it was, just enough of the economy could continue on the internet that we could decide to lock down societies to try and defeat a pandemic. And in doing so, we passed some very illiberal legislation, and we passed rules that allowed, in my country, huge fines to be levied on people for not doing what they were told, and for not allowing their, you know, of not being allowing themselves to be tracked, you know, so that, you know, 2 nights ago I went to the pub, I had to check in, and so the system would know that I was in that pub, so if someone else in that pub tests positive, I get a warning and I'm told to isolate. It's not a comfortable position, this. And, you know, you talk about facial recognition technologies, which are incredibly powerful and are being used by China, but also a lot of authorities in the West want to use them. And I'm always dismayed by how little ordinary people seem to mind about losing their liberties. That said, we mustn't, you know, get in the way of technology allowing people to have incredible improvements in their lives just because we're worried about personal privacy. So, for example, when the UK government does a lot of genomics research and has done for a number of years, and a lot of genome sequencing and analysis based on cancers and rare diseases and things like that. And they find that if you say to people, look, we're looking in your genome, we're going to find interesting things about it. We're going to be careful about anonymizing your data, but is that okay if we share this with some researchers and some companies trying to develop tests and so on? People say, yeah, that's fine. Of course, I want to help other people. So we mustn't be scared of some of the ethical concerns people raise. And in fact, they often say, can I bring my relatives in and you can test them too? You know, I think we were too frightened of the issue of genetic privacy, for example, genomic privacy, but we may not be frightened enough about facial recognition technology, which is a really spooky thing, isn't it?
Hey, Matt, thanks for this. Circling back on the great observation you made about kind of innovation trends around transportation and then transitioning into communications and how that may be bioengineering and healthcare. What do you think kind of hinders or like stops that innovations in a track? Basically, like it's not like we peaked in transportation. Anyone kind of flying economy class will tell you that this chair definitely can have a few improvements. So is just regulators kind of catching up with the technology and then kind of stopping it? Like why are we seeing kind of these waves of technologies like stopping in their tracks?
Very, very interesting question. And I think it's partly diminishing returns. You genuinely come up against physical limits. In the case of transportation, it was the problem of air resistance. You know, once you get to supersonic speeds, it gets much more expensive to power an airplane. In the case of computing and communication, it's Moore's law. We've got to the point where you can't make a transistor any smaller because you're down to the size of a handful of atoms, you know, and you just can't go much smaller than that. So I think there are physical limits. There are diminishing returns that you encounter. But I think there's also a regulatory issue there. I was talking to someone the other day who was making the point that the reason we have two companies making identical airliners in the world and nobody else is basically because of our obsession with safety. That means that nobody dares design an innovative aircraft. Nobody departs from the basic model of a tube with two wings and an engine on each wing. It just doesn't happen. And yeah, you're not wrong, of course, that innovation has continued in transportation. And the big improvement in safety of transport has come since that period, has come since the 1970s, with this incredible decline in the number of crashes of airliners. So, you know, that's great, but, you know, in cars, I was talking to someone today, actually, my car did something stupid, like suddenly fold the back seat down when I wasn't expecting it to. And we both agreed that the inability to change the engine much has led designers to do ridiculous things with electric motors inside cars that none of us really need. You know, I don't really mind winding down the window. Why have I got to have a button to press to do it? Anyway, you know, there's sort of innovation for the sake of it going on. But yeah, I would say it's a mixture of physical limits and regulatory barriers.
Hi, thank you for the very interesting talk. You mentioned earlier that there is an economic freedom in China, and I would really like if you could explain what do you mean, because I've heard that there are less than 10 private companies in China, and even though they're probably whatever related to the government. So what do you mean by economic freedom?
Yeah, it's a good point, because I'm referring to what the situation has been, but I think you're quite right. The situation is no longer like that. So, and you know, 10 years ago or 15 years ago, China was full of companies that did not belong to the government, that many of them would have had political connections or something like that. But basically, there was a freedom to set up a business to get started. If you look at the history of Alibaba or Tencent or one of these companies, it is very much an entrepreneurial sort of adventure, similar to what you got in Silicon Valley. But I think you're right that is changing. And the statistics you mentioned, that basically pretty well every company now has a political shareholding in it, has come about since the rise of Xi Jinping. I think he is a very different creature from his predecessors, and he is stifling economic freedom very rapidly. The dismemberment of Alibaba, of Jack Ma's empire that's going on at the moment, is going to be a huge disincentive to Chinese entrepreneurs. So I think I should really be talking in the past sense. We had a brief burst between Deng Xiaoping and Hu Jintao of economic freedom in China without any political freedom. We now have neither.
Saying that, what do you think the future of China is? Do you think they'll keep being innovative, or we'll see less and less of that?
No, I'm not at all optimistic that China can continue being innovative because of this problem. I think it still obviously has a lot of technology in development, and it has a lot of money to help develop it and so on. And we're going to see a lot of stuff coming out of China for a few years yet. But I think China will surrender its lead in innovation quite soon and quite rapidly.
Thank you.
I wanted to ask you about, you talked a lot about the need to put aside the barriers in order for people to do more innovative things, but I wanted to ask you about the need to do more regulations sometimes. As we see now, we part of, how can I say it, a lot of information about every one of us is spreading throughout the internet. And my question is, do we need to make sure that our information and the technology that uses this information, sometimes not for our benefit, will be more regulated in order for us to live our lives as we want, not as big companies want us to?
Yeah, well, on the one hand, clearly there is a need for something to happen. The days when Google and other companies could commodify and profit from the information that they have found out about me have to come to an end. It's pretty shocking when you think about it, the degree to which we have been exploited by these big tech companies in that respect. But on the other hand, there are examples of where we've tried to regulate these companies and we've made things worse. GDPR, the Generalized Data Protection Regulation in the European Union, was brought in to basically say you have to agree to cookies, I think they're called. You know, you have to say, I agree to my information being available to the company. And that was very well meant. And the idea was that we could opt out of having companies use our information. But it's been a complete failure in the sense that I never read it now. I just always click yes. And pretty well everybody I know does that, because otherwise you can't get to the website of the company you use. And the effect has been to create barriers to entry against small firms that can't get on the internet because in Europe, because they're not compliant with GDPR. So it has been a ball and chain around the smaller companies. The big companies are fine, they can afford this kind of stuff. And, you know, if you go on an obscure news website in North America, you know, a local paper or something, you find that they say, sorry, we're not compliant with GDPR, so you can't read our website. Whereas if you go on the New York Times, that's not a problem. You just click, yes, I agree. So that's a good example of regulation that was intended to do exactly what you're saying, which is to cramp the style of these exploitative big tech companies, but hasn't achieved, but has probably even entrenched their position. Since GDPR came in, the percentage of advertising revenue on the web that goes to the big boys has increased, not decreased. And that seems to me counterproductive. So I think I'm now in favor of some kind of trust-busting, anti-monopoly legislation in the US that would break these companies up. But I'm not enough of an expert to know how that would happen. And I have my doubts that it might make things worse, of course. Hi.
Really like to see you here and here. As you were, I'm not from the field of economics at all, I'm a psychologist, and as you were speaking, I was kind of running through my mind the development of psychology and theories, and kind of the way that it relates to innovation that I wanted to ask you about is, I was thinking about, how, starting from Freud, on the one hand was a huge innovator, but then kind of kicked out anybody who disagreed with him. And that kind of allowed other people to break from him and develop their own independent theories. But then, you know, learning about like the 100 years of development, a lot of things repeat itself. And now, you know, when I think about different therapies, there are a lot of things that they just like have in common. There are different, you know, titles or different names or different things. So my question is about what kind of promotes true innovation? Is it, you know, separation of camps, or maybe collaboration and working together is important to not have kind of the overlapping of theories? Yeah, because I kind of like, sometimes I feel like I'm studying the same things, but on the other hand, things are continuing to be developed.
Yeah, it's a really good point. I mean, I have a chapter in my book called Fakes, Fads, Frauds and Failures. And I'm talking there about innovations that were, you know, fake, basically, a lot of them. You know, people pretended to innovate and didn't. And to some extent, I think in intellectual disciplines, you can find the same phenomenon. I'm not quite going to go as far as to call Freud a fake, but there's a degree to which what you do in academia to establish your reputation is to exaggerate the importance of a relatively trivial insight and ride it as far as you can. And there are lots of examples in the history of psychology of experiments that were thought to show some very important phenomenon, which turned out to be not possible to reproduce and basically were not as meaningful as you think. So in that area, I think it is, we need to be wise to the possibility that some innovators are pretending to have discovered or invented something which they haven't necessarily, which isn't as important as they say it is. But as for how intellectual disciplines innovate and evolve generally, you've got on the one hand the problem that people are always trying to claim novelty, which is what I've just been talking about, you know, that my idea is new and brilliant and everybody's got to come on board. And then you've got the problem that you get orthodox groupthink that then is very hard to dislodge, and you only change the scientific paradigm when people die, you know, and a new generation comes along and tries something new. If you think about continental drift, for example, which is not a psychological phenomenon, I realize it's a geographical one, but Alfred Wegener in the early 20th century says, you know what, I think these continents used to fit together and have moved around since. And everybody says, don't be so stupid. You're a heretic, you're a blasphemer, you're wrong, you're an idiot. And it's only 50 years later, with the discovery of basically the sort of magnetic anomalies on the ocean floor and the mapping of the ocean floor, that people begin, and the discovery of plate tectonics, that it becomes possible then to say, actually, you know, that guy was right. So the degree to which intellectual orthodoxy prevents innovation in intellectual disciplines is tremendously important and a really key discipline to understand.
I actually have 3 questions, but it's too much, so I'll combine 2 and forget the third. My question is about the government being involved in projects that actually promote innovation. And we'll give 2 examples. One in Israel is, of course, the army. It's a worldwide famous, the intelligence services here, 8200 unit was called. And people say that a lot of the Israeli success has to do with that innovations that came out from the army, which is government funded. And another example is, of course, the vaccine that we have now. A lot of people on the left pointed out that a lot of the funding that went to the research and development of the vaccine for COVID came from the government, either in the stage of the basic research in universities, or even later on when the government gave money to the pharmaceutical companies. So just like to hear your take on that.
Yeah, we need to grapple with this question, and it's not an easy one, because it is true. I'm just going to have to sneeze. Sorry. It is true that a lot of government funding has gone into technologies that then end up being very important, whether it's GPS or vaccines or as you say, military spending of various kinds. And yes, it's right to recognize that. But I think we've often tended to exaggerate. This is a bit like the beaver and the rabbit, confusing the first injection of ideas with the eventual development. So, for example, people say, well, the Department of Defense invented the internet. Well, they invented one of the precursors of the internet, but it needed a huge amount of development in the civilian sector to come alive too. So my objection to the idea that we should credit the government with all innovation is based on that actually there's a lot more goes into innovation than just funding the first project. I was going to say something else as well about that. I've lost my train of thought. Sorry. It'll come back to me.
So I guess the only thing that, again, I keep thinking about this question about Singapore and Israel. And it's an interesting thing because, again, Singapore is #1 in the world in economic freedom. And Israel is certainly not. But I think Israel is an immensely more innovative country than Singapore. And I think it's worthwhile thinking about why that is and the relationship to freedom and innovation. I would just suggest one thing, and I was thinking about during the discussion is Jean Monnet, who founded the European common market, made the observation that there are two kinds of people. He said there are people that want to do something, and there are people that want to be somebody. And I think an innovative culture is a culture in which you have people who want to do something. And I certainly think this is very characteristic of this country. I think you need a culture of people that where there's a sense of meaning, where people want to do something, and you need to foster government policy and culture that allow it to happen. And I think Israel certainly could do a better job in the latter part. But I think in the former part, the country is extremely strong. So if you have anything to add to that, otherwise we'll thank you and let you go.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. I'm speaking to you from the northeast of England. 150 years ago, this was probably the most innovative place in the world. The railway, was invented here and all that, and an incredible ferment of innovation going on around the Tyne based on the thermodynamics of cheap coal and the attraction of people to come here and invent the turbine and all sorts of other things going on. This is not an innovative part of the world now. It's richer than it was then, but the culture has changed. The can-do attitude, the tendency of, it's very infectious innovation. Once it starts in an area, this is what Silicon Valley got right for a long time. This is what I think Israel is getting right now, is an infection of innovation, that you see other people trying it and you think that's a good idea, and we're back to the cultural question here. And a lot of that, as you say, has nothing to do with economic freedom, and that might be what Singapore has been unable to create.
Actually, I did not say it has nothing to do with it, but it doesn't seem to cause it. But I think it's definitely a necessary condition. I think it's a necessary condition and not a sufficient condition.
I agree with that. Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you, Matt. Very, very interesting.
Thank you, Robert. Thank you, all of you.